As pointless and ridiculous as these rankings are, I'm too competitive to let that BS go unnoticed. We'll prove them wrong this season. #clips.
You are Locked On Fantasy Basketball, your daily podcast on fantasy basketball. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hello and welcome to the Locked On Fantasy Basketball podcast brought to you by Basketball Monster. My name is Josh Lloyd and as always you can find me on Twitter at redrock_Bieber. We are back here today to finish off the season preview podcast series, and that is with the one team of course that is left over, and that is the LA Clippers. And to talk about all the things regarding the Clippers, a team that's had numerous changes this off-season, I'm joined by the host of the Locked On Clippers podcast, and that is Lucas Hann. Lucas, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Josh.
It's good to have you on. Good to talk about the Clippers, because there are numerous things that have changed with this team, and people have got lots of questions about how things are going to pan out with this squad, rotations, minutes, shots, all that sort of stuff, how it's all going to go down. So we're going to get into that straight away. And the way we start off all these shows is by looking at the players who have joined the team in the offseason. So let's start with the acquisitions that the Clippers made during the offseason. The number one guy, the main piece that they added was, of course, the Rooster, Danilo Gallinari, who comes across from the Denver Nuggets, and he slots into the starting small forward job, which has been a joke of a black hole pretty much for the last couple of seasons. One thing I guess we want to know about Gallinari, Lucas, at this point is, how's his injury tracking?
Well, there was a report in the last couple of days that he was actually just finishing up his recovery from that broken hand that he suffered gearing up for Eurobasket with Italy. So he should be totally 100% good to go for training camp. He'll even have, because it was a hand injury, he's been able to stay conditioning. So he'll have about a week to kind of get back into form. And then with training camp, he should be totally 100% by the beginning, which, obviously for a guy with his kind of injury history, you have to be worried all season long about what could happen. But it's good that he was able to at least come back from that off-season injury, and he should be fully good to get started with everyone.
Well, we know he hasn't played 65 games in either of the last 3 seasons. Let's hope that maybe this injury is the one injury that he does suffer this season and he can put together a full campaign. Of course, relying upon that's not going to be the smartest thing to do, but it is a possibility. As I always say, like, guys are injury prone until they aren't, and then guys are reliable or durable until they aren't as well. So things can change, and he could easily put together a 78 game campaign. It's probably unlikely and you wouldn't want to rely upon it, but there is a possibility that happens. Now, he moves in as the second offensive threat probably on this Clippers team, who's a chance to really put up some decent scoring numbers, hit those threes, get to the line quite a bit, which is something that he's improved on significantly over the last couple of seasons. How do you feel about him playing at the 3? Because it's probably not his best position at this point in his career.
Well, I think the main concerns that come with Gallinari at small forward are probably on the defensive end of the floor, where you worry about lateral quickness and matchups, especially because the Clippers play so big at power forward and center with Blake Griffin and DeAndre Jordan, that there just isn't necessarily a lot of versatility defensively, and you're not really sure who guards perimeter players in that lineup. I mean, it's going to be Gallinari, but the Nuggets were better using Gallinari at the power forward position defensively and letting Wilson Chandler take those tougher assignments. Blake Griffin is not Wilson Chandler in terms of perimeter defense. On the offensive end of the court, I don't think it's going to be an issue at all. I think you just look at the fact that these guys have talent. They have the kind of games that should go well together. Blake Griffin is very versatile. He can play all over the floor. He added that jump shot in the back half of last season, stepping back to the three-point line. And then Gallinari is just a very, very efficient basketball player. And even though he's not a prolific passer in terms of assists, he makes good plays, he makes smart plays. And so you put two superbly offensively talented players like Gallinari and Griffin next to each other in a lineup, and it should be very, very productive for both of them, especially on that offensive end.
Gallinari is getting drafted to pick 79 on Yahoo and 89 on ESPN. I think a lot of that is taking into account the injury risk, but on a per-game basis, he can easily crack the top 50. So when you get to those later rounds, when you're looking for a boost in scoring and are looking for a boost in free throw percentage, two things that Gallinari really excels at, and three-pointers, he's a very good good selection because it is hard to be able to influence the points and free throw percentage category that late in your drafts. He's not going to be a high rebound or assists or steals, or he's not going to block any shots or anything like that, but he can provide in those other categories. So if your team has been fairly risk averse in terms of injury risk or currently injured players, grabbing Gallinari there is fine. But if you've grabbed, say, Joel Embiid and Isaiah Thomas and Zach LaVine, then you probably don't want to go with Gallinari there because it's just putting too much injury risk on your team or guys that are currently injured. So he is a value guy, and I can see myself getting him in quite a number of situations just because of how far down he is slipping. The other thing about Gallinari is we talked about him being best at the four. And I think this is a question with the entirety of the Clippers rotation. Does he act as the primary backup at the four, meaning we're going to see more Sam Dekker minutes at the three, or do you think that Doc will run a bigger backup unit and play Willie Reed and Montrezl Harrell as the backup 4-5 together?
Yeah, so I think that this is actually a really interesting question, and I wish that I had like a obvious answer, but it is a little bit of puzzling roster construction for the Clippers in this case, if only because Gallinari, as we've established, is probably more effective as a 4 than a 3. Sam Dekker is a guy who played almost exclusively at the small ball 4 position for Houston last year. And then Montrezl Harrell plays the 4 and the 5. Willie Reed is a 5. And so even though it seems like it might be a little more ideal to have Gallinari kind of staggered in and out of lineups with Blake Griffin and coming in as the backup power forward, and like it might be ideal to have a guy like Sam Dekker be the backup power forward instead of the backup small forward, I think just because of where the bodies are on the Clippers roster, especially the solid rotation caliber players, that we probably will see Gallinari playing a lot of small forward minutes and Sam Dekker playing a lot of backup small forward minutes, and then, like you said, Harrell and Reed teamed up as the backup bench unit. I'm not sure how effective that's going to be, especially that second unit from a floor spacing perspective with Dekker, who is inconsistent, and then Harrell and Reed, who are both much more around the rim guys. So we could see Doc Rivers make an adjustment at some point and try to integrate Wesley Johnson into the second unit, or maybe play some 3-guard lineups. But overall, it is a little bit of a question mark, I think. And it's definitely something that, as the roster was being built, I thought that they would look more for another wing than another big man to be able to have that flexibility to move Gallinari and Dekker to power forward at times.
I hate that combination of Harrell and Reed playing as a front court. And we know that Doc is very much anti-staggering lineup, so you're going to see those two guys play together a bit. I don't like that lineup, but as you said, the way that things are sort of set up, that's sort of the way they're going to have to go. But a guy to watch is a guy who did come across in that Chris Paul trade, and that is Sam Dekker. That if Gallinari does miss his 20 games or so this season, Dekker's going to have to move into that starting lineup, and he would be definitely worth a look in a fantasy situation there. He's nowhere near worth drafting at this point. More of a 20-team league guy, if at all, but he'd be a name to watch because they really don't have anyone else they're going to play there. And you mentioned Wesley Johnson. I laughed a little bit because Doc just refused to play him at all last season, was playing Paul Pierce minutes over him, which was ridiculous in my mind, but he just have no faith in Wes whatsoever, even though he has shown a level of effectiveness over the last couple of seasons. Definitely not the level of effectiveness you'd want out of a number 4 overall pick, but definitely a higher level of impact than, say, 54-year-old Paul Pierce was providing last season. The other guys that came across, Lou Williams. Lou Williams and Pat Beverley, let's talk about these two guys together because obviously they're both guards and they join Austin Rivers and Milos Teodosic in that backcourt. This is the question that I guess befuddles me to a degree, and I'm sure many people have this question. How the hell is he going to work out this 4-man guard rotation?
Yeah, I think that Lou Williams probably ends up being the odd man out in this situation just because when you consider these 4 guys and you rank, the value, how much the team values each of them, Patrick Beverley is a guy that they basically got back in the Chris Paul trade, and he immediately stepped into a leadership role. I think he got to he was traded to the Clippers on Wednesday morning, and Friday afternoon he was at the meeting with Blake Griffin telling him, re-sign with the Clippers, we're going to do something here. And so I think Beverley is probably slotted into the number 4 most important player on the team role behind Griffin, Gallinari, and DeAndre Jordan. Now, obviously, Beverley isn't a big fantasy stats guy, but I think that he's going to get a lot of priority in terms of minutes because of his importance on the team. And then you just look at Milos Teodosic is a guy who the Clippers just brought over from Europe. on a 2-year contract. Austin Rivers is a young up-and-coming player. He's 25 years old, and this is kind of going to be a make-or-break year for him in the sense that he will get probably a lot of minutes and possibly a lot of starts. And this is a chance for him to either prove that he is a starting caliber player, in which case he can decline his player option next summer and look for a long-term big salary contract as a starting caliber guard. Or maybe if he doesn't perform up to that caliber, we learn that Austin is a solid backup like he's been the last couple of years, but not going to take that next step. And then Lou Williams is almost like an afterthought. He was mostly included in the trade as salary filler. He's on an expiring contract, so he's not as much of a part of the Clippers' long-term plans as the other three guys. And I think if anything, he could be a guy who could be expendable for a midseason trade. Out of anyone on the roster, I would be least surprised to see Lou Williams traded around the deadline.
Yeah, I could see that totally. Now, I don't think there's any danger of Williams starting. I think he's still going to be able to get his scoring. He gets to the line, he'll get his free throws, he'll get his threes, and he can be a valuable piece there. He's getting drafted decently high at 74 on Yahoo and 79 on ESPN, which is ahead of Danilo Gallinari, which makes absolutely zero sense to me. Under no circumstance would I be picking Lou Williams ahead of Gallinari, but that's the way it's currently going on both Yahoo and ESPN. You talked about Beverly not being a great fantasy stats guy, and that's true, but he is still a valuable player. He's a guy that I would take comfortably inside the top 100. He's getting drafted just inside the top 100. I think there's a little bit of value there for his ability to maybe get to 2 threes a game, get 4 assists, be a really strong rebounder as a point guard, and get those steal numbers. I think he's going to have that sort of value. His upside is pretty limited, but what he can do is solid in those mid to late round areas. The guy that a lot of people don't know too much about is Teodosic, who comes across, Lucas, I believe, as probably a top 5 passer in the NBA already before he even steps onto the court. He is going to get assists. I don't think there's anyone that can doubt that. The problem is how is he going to stay on the court with his defense? And that's the concern that some people have. Now, I think that Doc will start Beverly and Rivers in the starting backcourt, which to me feels like a mistake, because that means you're going to be pairing Teodosic and Williams as a worst defensive backcourt in maybe the history of the NBA, and that could be a problem. But Teodosic is going to get his playing time. He's going to get his assists, and if they can figure out, or Doc can figure out a way to maybe start Rivers and Beverly, but then play a lot of Teodosic-Rivers combinations or Beverly-Teodosic combinations, it will really be able to work to each player's strengths and weaknesses. So do you see Teodosic at the age of 30, after all this European competition, international competition, being able to translate his skills pretty much straight away to the NBA?
Yeah, I think, there might be a little bit of an adjustment period, but that might only last as far as in training camp and preseason, playing with guys who are used to playing the NBA game. We've seen him in the past playing in exhibition preseason games against NBA teams and doing quite well for himself. We've seen him do well for himself in international competition against the U.S. national team. And so this isn't a situation where I'm not concerned that he's going to come over and be a dud. I think he's going to be a rotation player, but it's going to be a matter of how productive he can be. And I think a lot of it is going to hinge, like you said, on that defense, because if he can come over and just be like a normal, bad NBA guard defender, but he brings elite three-point shooting and he orchestrates the offense, he could be a guy who could be very, very valuable, especially on a second unit, like we mentioned, that has guys like Sam Decker and Montrezl Harrell and Willie Reed who don't create much for themselves but are excellent cutters. Then we could start to see a little bit of a high-energy, up-tempo unit with Teodosic leading the break and finding these guys. But there's also, a side to it where if the shooting is a little bit lower and those passing lanes aren't quite as open as they were in Europe, and the defense is really, really, really bad, then he could struggle to, I'm not going to say to earn playing time, but to earn significant playing time. I think right now going into training camp, you have to look at it with those top 3 guys, Beverly, Rivers, and Teodosic at the guard positions, all being in pretty good standing and relatively equal to one another in terms of who's going to be getting the minutes. I think that Teodosic might have the most upside of the 3 and the most downside of the 3, probably just because, like you said, we aren't exactly sure how he's going to translate to the NBA game.
I agree with that completely. He has got by far the most upside of these guys. He's getting drafted at pick 140, so basically the last pick. If he gets 28 minutes and up, which might be a stretch for him, he comfortably breaks the top 100, like comfortably, just because of his ability to get assists and get a steal a game, hit threes, score a little bit there as well. I love him as a late pick just to get those assists, which can be super valuable to get. And I would take him over Austin Rivers in pretty much any situation, because Rivers, while I think it's almost a guarantee that he gets more minutes than what Teodosic does, he just isn't a good fantasy producer. He's a poor free throw shooter. He's not an efficient shooter from the field. He doesn't rack up assists or get steals or do anything in high volumes, whereas Teodosic has that ability to get you 6.5, maybe 7 assists if he's pushed into a full-time 30-minute-ish type of role. If he gets to that, the assists are going to come, and they're going to come in large quantities, and getting that with a last pick. Again, if it doesn't work out and if he comes and sucks for the first 2 weeks and plays 18 minutes a night because Doc Rivers isn't happy with what he's providing, then you get rid of him. That's fine. But Rivers just doesn't have anywhere near that level of upside. And Rivers is getting picked at 116 in ESPN as opposed to Teodosic at 140. There is no way in hell that I would be taking Rivers in any situation above him. Rivers is more of a 14 to 16 team league guy who can be solid but has just very little upside to improve multiple areas that are going to be useful for us in fantasy situations. We talked a little bit about... go ahead.
I think that... that, like you said, Milos, especially in like a 28 to 30 minute role, it wouldn't surprise me to see him get 6 or 7 assists a night, even if he's struggling. But I would say that Austin might have a little more value than a lot of people think, especially if you look at his splits. Last season in games where he started, which is 29 games, so it's not a terribly small sample size, his averages go up to 16 points, 4 assists, 3 rebounds. He's shooting 42% from 3, 46% from the field. And what we tended to see with Austin is that last season, a lot of his inconsistency came because of the Clippers' injury struggles and their lack of depth at small forward. He was all around the rotation. So we saw him at times playing 40 minutes. We saw him as a fill-in starter at point guard, shooting guard, and small forward for different chunks of the season. And we saw him at sometimes being relegated to a bench role of 18 minutes. I think in a more consistent role, especially a high-volume role where he's one of the guys who seems to play better the more minutes he's getting and the more in rhythm he is with the game, I could see him having a sort of breakout year, a 16 to 18 point a game season.
Yeah, I could see him getting to 16 points, no problem. I don't have him projected that high. It's more just the fact that his percentages could really suffer, and that can be a real issue in fantasy leagues for both of those percentages. He's a really poor rebounder as well. And the assist numbers, I just think with Teodosic around, he just might not have that. I think his assist numbers do increase when, say, Chris Paul was out. I'd have to go and check those numbers, but I'm pretty sure his assist rate jumped up when Paul wasn't on the court, whereas in this situation, you'll have Beverly and you'll have Teodosic also handling the ball, and they'll be playing Rivers, I would say, off the ball more than on the ball, which is something that he did a little bit more of in previous seasons. Montrezl Harrell comes across. He showed bits and pieces for Houston last year, but he was the third string center, so he didn't play in every night or didn't play every game. Do you think he's going to be a regular every night contributor, as we talked about him playing at the 4? And do you think that the Clippers are going to be placing a level of not trust, but hope in him into developing something in the future, or is he more just a throw-in in the deal?
I expect to be seeing Montrez playing pretty regularly. I think that the Clippers have set themselves up, like we talked about, with both of those small forwards who can slide to power forward. And you figure Blake Griffin obviously is going to be playing a ton of minutes. So there's definitely limited upside for Montrezl Harrell, especially this season. But when you factor in the team's long-term plans, Willie Reed is on a 1-year veterans minimum contract. His goal with this contract is to build value and sign somewhere else for more money next season. Montrezl Harrell is a guy who the Clippers have on his rookie deal. They're going to have restricted free agency rights on him, I believe, next summer. Yep. So they're in a situation with Montrez that even if his performances aren't great, I still think that he's going to be integrated into the rotation pretty regularly, just because he's a guy that I think it gives the franchise long-term value to get him comfortable with the team and turn him into a rotation guy, because you look at the Clippers potentially giving DeAndre Jordan a massive extension next summer to match the one that Blake Griffin got a few months ago. And if you can get a guy like Montrezl Harrell in restricted free agency on a decent 4-year deal, and he can play both of those backup big positions, and we've seen this year that it's been rough for restricted free agents in the NBA. So if the Clippers can get a bargain on Montrezl Harrell next summer, then that could be really productive for them in the long term. So I think he does stand to get some minutes this season and to really be a guy that's on Doc Rivers' mind. I just don't know that he's going to be featured regularly enough, especially for fantasy purposes, especially with the Clippers bringing in a guy like Willie Reed, who is a better player than him at this moment in time.
Well, that was the next question I was going to ask you, because last year when Clint Capella went down in Houston, we saw Harrell step in and put up good numbers. When Hassan Whiteside missed games in Miami, Willie Reed stepped in and put up good numbers. So if DeAndre Jordan was to go down, you think it would be Reed that would step into that starting role?
Yeah, I think that Willie is the more natural fit, and I think that the Clippers may have gone with Reed when they were able to get him at that price late in free agency, just because they felt like, Doc Rivers ultimately is still in the mindset of competing. He's in the mindset of winning his games, as many games as possible. And so even though the Clippers roster got a lot younger, they signed their rookies, they're looking a little more towards the future, whereas in years past with Chris Paul, it was all about this year. And now maybe the mindset is the next 3 years or the next 5 years. Not 5 years from now, but you want to maintain a little flexibility so that you can make these adjustments going forward, and you want to develop guys in-house for the next 3 to 5 years. But I do think that Doc Rivers ultimately is still the kind of guy who, if he can get a marginal upgrade, if he can get a guy that he feels like, if we're in a playoff game and DeAndre has 5 fouls and signing this guy is going to give me an option that I trust a little bit more to put in, then he's going to do that, even if it means, obviously, adding Willie is going to sacrifice the potential role for Montrez. But I do think that Willie was brought in specifically for that purpose, kind of the same purpose as we've seen guys like Brandon Bass or Raymond Felton be brought in the past, where Doc just wants someone who he feels like he can rely on, even at the expense of maybe a little youth development that could come from throwing a guy into the fire.
What's the status on Willie Reed's arrest?
I'm not totally sure. I think that, it's a slow process, and I think he's still waiting for some of that stuff to shake out. But he is going to be at the team's media day, so it seems as though right now everything is going forward as normal.
DeAndre Liggins also signed, as did Jamil Wilson, on a two-way deal. We're not going to see Wilson play too much. He played for the summer league team. Now, Liggins, who sort of started an inordinate amount of games for the Cavs last season and then played, I think, one game for the Mavs at the end of the season. I don't think we're going to be seeing too much of him in the rotation, given the amount of guards we already spoke about. We've got the small forwards there with Gallinari and Decker and Wes Johnson in the mix too. So he's more of an emergency guy, but Doc loves those veteran defensive type of players, so maybe we'll see him jump in. But he is as irrelevant as a fantasy player as there pretty much is in the entire NBA, so we don't need to talk too much about him.
I would just add that the Clippers right now have 14 guaranteed contracts, and Liggins isn't one of them.
Yep.
And those 14 contracts take them to about $90,000 underneath the luxury tax. So in order for him to even make it out of training camp, he would have to prove to some sort of value to the Clippers that makes the Doc Rivers and Lawrence Frank and Jerry West think we're willing to pay the luxury tax this season and pay the repeater tax down the line to keep him on the roster. So it's hard to imagine them keeping him unless he somehow really comes in and outplays a guy like Sam Decker, or if Austin Rivers gets injured in training camp and he really is going to be a rotation guy. It's hard to see them even keeping him through to opening night, where the potential luxury tax penalties of his salary could cost them tens of millions of dollars in the 3 years to come.
The guys that left this team, we've got a whole list of them. Chris Paul obviously traded to the Rockets. JJ Redick went to the Sixers. Jamal Crawford to the Wolves. Mo Spates went to the Magic. Marmute to the Rockets. Ray Felton to the Thunder. Brandon Bass, Alan Anderson are currently without teams. Paul Pierce has retired, and Diamond Stone has ended up with the Bulls via the Atlanta Hawks. But I want to talk about the draft with you, Lucas, because it's not often that I can feel excited about a Clippers draft. And with these two picks, these were two guys that I was really, really interested in. It sort of bums me out that they both went to the Clippers, given the way that Doc just absolutely refuses to play rookies the majority of the time, and they just get sort of lost. But let's start with Juwan Evans, who I thought should have gone in the first round. I think the Clippers getting him at this spot is fantastic. We're not going to see a huge amount of him this season. I think we'll see a lot of him in the G League for Agua Caliente Clippers, but he's a short guy who hits his shots, makes plays. I'm really excited about what he can bring for the future of this team. What did you think of that draft pick, and how do you think they're going to look to use him this season?
Well, I really liked both of the picks, and I especially, from my perspective, the Clippers didn't have any picks, and they purchased both picks, which is like freebies. So I'm all for that. I think that Jawan is the better prospect of the two.
I agree.
And I think that could not be made any more straightforward than by the fact that the Clippers bought 2 picks and they picked him first and then hoped that Sindarius would fall to them at 48. But I do think that we're probably less likely to see Jawan this season playing real NBA minutes because of the Clippers' depth at those guard positions and just the fact that he probably has a little more work to do to get to being able to handle NBA minutes than Sindarius. Jawan, and I don't want anyone to think that I'm down on these guys because I'm high on both of them, especially for second-round picks. But I think maybe a lot of people think, Clippers got good rookies. They should be in the rotation right away. And I don't think that Jawan is a guy who's ready to be in the rotation right away. You look at him, especially with his size, he doesn't have amazing court vision. He tends to over-penetrate and find himself in tough situations, and then he just kind of throws up crazy floaters, and sometimes those can spark fast breaks for the other team. So I think that what he might need to learn is to take that amazing speed and quickness that he has and use to learn it in bursts and, learn to come off of the corner on a pick and roll. And instead of putting his head down and just trying to get to the basket as quick as he can, keep that head up, take a beat, and see how the play is developing. So that's something that hopefully he can learn in the D-League. And then I think if he's able to get that sort of vision and patience, when you combine it with his athleticism and his skill set, he really does have potential to be a quality NBA player. Sindarius, I think, has probably the higher floor but the lower ceiling. His real problem is going to be developing that NBA three-point shot. In Summer League, it did not look pretty. And he's the kind of guy who wasn't a natural shooter when he got to college, and he really learned that corner collegiate 3 set shot, and now he's going to have to relearn how to do it at NBA range. But if he's able to make a respectable amount of NBA range 3-pointers, then you look at a guy who is a gritty, tough defender. He's probably already an above average NBA wing defender, and he's just a basketball player. He's smart, he's skilled, he does a lot of things in different spots on the floor, from passing, rebounding, setting screens, coming off of curls. So I'm excited about both of these guys. I think that they'll probably make the Agua Caliente Clippers debut season really exciting.
Both of these guys have tremendous fantasy projections, and I think both of them, if you're looking at dynasty-type drafts, they should be both selected ahead of where they were selected in the NBA draft. I would have Evans no problem inside the top 25 rookies for fantasy, and Thornwell probably inside the top 30 to 32 sort of guys in that range. For what they can do, I am with you. I think that Evans is the better prospect. I think that we probably see a little bit more of Thornwell this season, though, just given the roster construction and what he can do for this team. And I think we might actually see Thornwell play more minutes than we've seen for rookie or past rookies under the Doc Rivers coaching and management regime that we've seen from the Clippers in the past. So I think we might see a little bit more of Thornwell, but not too much.
I think how you talked about DeAndre Liggins kind of being that wing defender, break glass in case of emergency kind of guy, because, how I said with the contract situation, the Clippers are very, very unlikely to keep Liggins because it would be costing them a ton of money in luxury and repeater tax payments. I think that Sindarius actually sort of becomes that guy, where if you think about it, if you're looking for a guy to defend at the 2-3, and, the guys in the rotation there are going to be Teodosic, Rivers, Lou Williams, Gallinari, Sam Decker. But if you need an extra defensive body, or if there's injuries and you need someone to slot in at shooting guard, I don't think you're going with Wesley Johnson over Sindarius Thornwell. So I think that that's where he could maybe serve as a depth piece, where I think that even if the Clippers have some issues at point guard, just because of the fact that all 4 of those guards in their rotation can play the point guard, it'd be hard for Jawan to get minutes this year.
Yeah, that's completely how I see it as well. But again, if we're talking long term, I think Evans is the higher upside guy. But yeah,
absolutely,
Thornwell's a really interesting player for this season, and let's hope that we get some sort of run out of him. Now, we've sort of danced around the issue of the biggest name on this team who just signed a huge contract in the offseason, and that is Blake Griffin. We know about his injury concerns over the course of his career, but there's conflicting information about what's actually happening with him at the moment. There's some people saying that he's not going to be ready to start the season after this toe problem, and then there's him saying, no, he's fine. He's going to be ready for training camp and ready to go. I tend to believe that he will be fine to start the season. That's not predicting that he's going to be fine throughout the season, because we know that whatever sort of weird shit can go down with Blake Griffin, it will happen. Like, something weird will happen. He'll get elbow infections or broken hands, or his knees will fall off, or something weird will happen with Griffin. But at the moment, Lucas, his toe, are we expecting him ready to go for opening night?
Yeah, just with where we are right now, I see no reason to believe, and anonymous sources, I think came from ESPN. I see no reason to believe an anonymous source's ESPN report when Blake Griffin and the team have come out and refuted it. It seems that if they really thought he was going to be out, sure, maybe they would try to keep it under wraps for as long as possible. But you wouldn't come out and say he's going to be ready to start training camp if you knew he wasn't.
Yeah, exactly.
Right?
Yeah.
Like, they might not comment, or they might try to keep it under wraps or whatever, but you wouldn't go out and lie if you really don't think he's going to be ready. And I believe that ESPN report came from a timeline when an ESPN reporter spoke to a doctor who is not Blake Griffin's doctor, just about the injury in general and what the timeline, quote unquote, should be, and then use that to decide that he wouldn't be back until December. But Blake and his doctors and the team all say that in his specific case, he's going to be back for training camp. So I don't see any reason to go away from that. I think his injury problem is a really interesting point when, you talked about earlier, guys are solid until they aren't, and they are injury prone until they aren't. And he's a guy who, in his rookie season, missed that whole year and was initially supposed to be able to come back in January, and then there was some misdiagnosis. He missed the full season. But then in years 2, 3, 4, and 5, he missed a total of 4 games across those 4 seasons. And then in the 3 latest seasons, he's obviously missed pretty significant time, playing 67, 35, and 61. So like you said, it's almost like the flukiness of his injuries, which you're absolutely right that it just seems to always be some crazy random thing happening to him. It almost gives me a little bit of hope that he might have a better chance to be healthy going forward than, for example, a guy like Danilo Gallinari with his injury history, because it doesn't seem like Blake's problem is that his left knee isn't holding up and he hurts his left knee every season. It seems that he's had 3 seasons now where something really random and fluky has gone wrong. And so I think more than anything, you hope that it really was just random fluky stuff, and that now you can get back to a season where something random and fluky doesn't happen, as was the case in those 4 seasons where he played almost every game for 4 straight years.
That's sort of the reasoning that I had. Like, I spoke about Anthony Davis a lot last year, said, look, I feel pretty confident about him. He doesn't have any persistent problems that are causing him these issues. It's not like he's just continually hurting his left shoulder every single time, or it's his right knee. It's just these weird knocks of falling into the stands and getting bruised, whatever. And I said, look, that's fine. That stuff happens to people. And I think it's the same with Griffin. So I do have a level of confidence with him that he will be okay. Like, I'm not, much like Gallinari, I'm not relying upon it, but I think that he can have a really big season. Like last year, or not last year, this season now with Chris Paul, I think without Chris Paul, he's got this huge chance to increase his numbers. Last year, when he wasn't on the court with Chris Paul, he had an assist rate of 8.8 assists per 100 possessions. When he shared the court with Chris Paul, it was at 6.1. So we're talking about a significant difference. So he could be out here averaging 6.5 assists per game, perhaps, over 20 points a game, 8 boards. We saw over the second half of last season he was hitting at least a 3 per game also, so that's another string to his bow. The one thing that's never going to happen with Griffin, though, I don't believe, Lucas, is he's not going to be ever able to provide defensive numbers. He's not going to come out and start blocking 1.5 shots a game. He's just not going to do it. He's not going to start racking up big steal numbers, but points, rebounds, assists, decent field goal percentage. He's improved his free throw percentage considerably over the course of his career, and now he's adding threes. He has got top 20 upside in fantasy leagues. I would take him in the 3rd round without any hesitation whatsoever. He's currently being drafted at 37 on Yahoo and 38 on ESPN. No problem with that. I would take him at 34, 32. I would take him at 30, especially given that the dearth of big men who are consistent and are going to get big minutes and are going to rebound the ball and score. Taking him at the start of a 3rd round, around that 30th mark, I got no problem with that. I think he's in for a big season with significant upside. Do you think that when he is sharing the court with Beverly, he will be running as the point guard more? And how do you see that changing, say, when Teodosic is out there? Or do you think that those guys won't share the court as much for that particular reason?
I think it'll be I was going to actually bring that up before that ended up being your question, that Blake seems to be the best passer on the Clippers roster, and then they went out and got Milos Teodosic, who's obviously used to being more of a floor general and having the ball in his hands. And so that the Teodosic signing might give the Clippers a little more comfort, because I think even more than any other team in the league, the Clippers had a guy in Chris Paul who basically took every dribble of every possession every game and just dominated the ball. If there was like time of possession in the NBA, he would have like 3 times more than second place in the league. He always was touching the basketball. And so that's a difficult transition. And so I talked about last season, when Chris Paul goes down with an injury, it's a big adjustment for the players around him, because you look at guys like JJ Redick and DeAndre Jordan, who are used to purely finishing a play after Chris Paul did something. And then the guys like Austin Rivers and Jamal Crawford, who really stepped up their creative duties when Chris Paul was out, now he comes back and their role has been completely redefined. So it's going to be interesting to see how the Clippers adjust this season. I do think Blake's assist numbers are going to be very high. We've seen him the last 3 years at 5 assists a game. We saw him during that really great playoff run a couple years ago, over 6 assists a game. I would expect him to be in the 6 assists a game range. I think even if he ends up playing a lot of minutes with Teodosic, he's going to find his assists, especially because a lot of what he does well is, being the screener in the pick and roll and then getting the ball in the high post and having a ton of options, from taking that mid-range shot, throwing a high-low lob to DeAndre, driving to the basket, kicking out to shooters, and especially with Mbah a Moute off the floor now, who's been with the team the last couple seasons, it does make the entire unit more potent offensively, which potentially could enhance the assist numbers of everyone involved, because that 5th guy on the floor in the shooter is now going to be Danilo Gallinari and not Lucas Hann.
Who leads the team in assists?
I think it'll be close between Teodosic and Griffin. I think they'll both be above 6. I think Blake is probably a safer bet. Blake could be really in the 6 to 7 assist range. He'll get, I think, a good amount of triple doubles this coming season, and I think he will be the primary offensive distributor. Even though Teodosic, when he's in, will see a lot of the basketball in his hands, I think Blake Griffin is going to be the guy creating offensively for the Clippers this season.
I've got Griffin at 6.1 and I've got Teodosic at 6.3 assists for this season at this point. So I've got them both above 6. I've got them both pretty close. That's why I just wanted to check what you're thinking. I could easily see Griffin actually getting to 7 assists per game. I don't think that's a stretch at all for him to get to that level. The other holdover star on this team is DeAndre Jordan, of course, who is just locked into his role as the starting center. We know what he's going to give you. He's going to block shots. He's going to get rebounds at a very high rate. He's going to score an okay amount. He's not going to pass the ball. He's not going to hit free throws at all, and you can't draft him in any situation unless you're punting free throws. You cannot recover from having DeAndre Jordan on your team. You cannot get to being competitive. You cannot get to being average if he is on your team. So if you've got him, you are losing that category. Unless you're facing off against the team with Andre Drummond, you are losing that category. So just accept that. Don't try to build around it to try and get your free throws up. You won't. His field goal percentage is going to be high. Now, I hear a lot of people saying to me, Lucas, that I would expect DeAndre Jordan's efficiency in field goal percentage, which we're talking about a number that hovers over 70%. It's going to come down now because he won't have Chris Paul throwing his lobs. But last season, in the minutes that DeAndre Jordan shared the court with Chris Paul, he shot 71% from the field. In the 800-plus minutes he had on the court without Chris Paul, and that's not an insignificant amount. In fact, that's more than Joel Embiid played for an entire season. He shot 72.5% from the field. So in that sample size, while it's not excessive, it's not tiny, he actually was a more effective field goal percentage guy. He actually shot at a higher rate, which I'm not sure that can stay over the course of a season, but it does give us some data or some fuel for thought to say, well, he's not going to drop off the cliff because Chris Paul's not throwing him these passes anymore.
Yeah, I think that the efficiency shouldn't really change much because of Chris Paul, in the sense that, like you said, I was going to bring that point up, that he actually shot better when Chris Paul was off the floor last season. And what he does in terms of finishing is really going to be there no matter who's passing it to him. I could be out there and throw it up and he's all he's doing is dunking. I think what's more concerning when you lose a guy like Chris Paul and I think a little underrated Jamal Crawford, who's had excellent chemistry with DeAndre in that side pick and roll over the years. I think what you lose maybe a little bit more is the volume.
Yep.
Because while DeAndre, he's going to finish those lobs and putbacks above 70% or at, in that range where he's been at. But the question is he going to get 7 field goal attempts a game without Chris Paul there to find him? Now, the Clippers have a number of guys who can find him, and I think that actually Chris Paul's lob throwing has probably been a little exaggerated over the years. He doesn't throw that many lobs. He definitely threw less lobs. It was a notable decline in lobs thrown when the Clippers transitioned from Baron Davis to Chris Paul. Obviously, the quality was made up for in other ways, but I don't think the Chris Paul to DeAndre lobs are a huge thing to worry about, but I would, in general, worry about without Chris Paul and JJ Redick spacing the floor, if the offense becomes less potent, then less times teams are going to have to be kind of hedging off of DeAndre, leaving him open for those lobs, so he might not get 7 attempts a game. And then in the same vein, in a less potent offense, the Clippers might look to DeAndre and ask him to do a little bit more. They might give him more opportunities in the post than we've seen in the past, where he's gotten the occasional post up and he's been okay, but we haven't seen it in a high volume or at a high efficiency. And so if they decide that we're going to throw the ball to DeAndre 5 or 6 times a game, even if he converts those at 50, 52%, that could really drag down his field goal percentage.
DeAndre is getting drafted at pick 44 on Yahoo and 39 on ESPN. But as I'll say to you again, I'll say to everyone listening again, if you're playing in a rotisserie league that's a standard 12-team, 9 or 8 category roto league, you don't draft him at all. In a head-to-head league, if you're punting free throws, he's got top 20 value, so taking him in the 3rd round is totally fine. In fact, I just did a points league mock draft for the guys at Roto World today, and I think I took DeAndre in the 3rd round and Andre Drummond in the 2nd round because I wasn't worrying about free throw percentage in that sort of a setup. So he's going to put up those numbers, the rebounds, the blocks, the field goal percentage. It's all going to be solid. So it depends on how you're looking to set your team up. But again, if you're in a rotisserie standard format, you don't want to deal with it. You just forget about him, don't draft him whatsoever. Now, in certain situations in roto leagues, if you play in a 16-team or a 20-team league, or you play in a league that's got 12 categories or 13 categories, punting actually becomes a viable strategy. So then he does gain some value in those rotisserie formats. But if it's a standard 12-teamer with 8 or 9 cats, then you just want to avoid him in that sort of a situation. Couple of guys that we haven't spoken about. Bryce Johnson, who had an interesting summer league. I thought he showed a high degree of confidence, but he looked okay, but he didn't play at all really last season. He had a back issue with a disc there. Is there any way that he cracks into the rotation in his 2nd season in the NBA, or all those power forward big men that we've already mentioned, is he just going to be resigned to being that 15th man again?
I think he maybe has a chance, especially because, there's a lot up in the air. And I think that guys like Sam Decker and Montrezl Harrell, who figure to be above him in the power forward power rankings going into training camp, are potentially vulnerable if Bryce plays well. But I think that Bryce's real problem last season was that he had that herniated disc in his back early on. He missed most of the season. And even then, when he returned and was able to start practicing with the team again, especially being a rookie, he was just way behind the curve. It's hard enough being a rookie in the NBA and starting in November, but it's very hard to be a rookie in the NBA starting in February. What's concerning with Bryce is that there were reports coming out of training camp before he injured his back that the Clippers' 2nd round pick from that year, Diamond Stone, had actually worked his way above Bryce in the pecking order over the course of training camp, and that Bryce was not impressing very much for the Clippers coaching staff. And then what we saw in Summer League, even though he was confident, he put up numbers, he seems to have skill, he has a questionable motor, and it's unclear how much he's really improved over the course of his first year in the NBA. And he's not super young anymore, even for a guy who is essentially going to be a rookie. He's 23 now. So it's like, it's going to be difficult for him, I think. And I'm not sure that he's going to really be an NBA guy. I'm very skeptical about Bryce Johnson.
So it's fair to say, Lucas, that you don't agree with Michael Wilbon, who said that he would take Bryce Johnson over Ben Simmons any day of the week.
Yeah, I would not do that. No.
One of the greatest.
Is...
It's one of the greatest tweets of all time. Give me Bryce Johnson over Ben Simmons any day of the week. I want a proven winner. Cool, Wilbon. That's why you are an idiot, and that's why we don't take any advice from you regarding anything that's related to the NBA, even though your head shows up on all those telecasts. So we're not taking Bryce Johnson there. The thing is that his game for fantasy looks good. He can rebound at a high rate. He's decent steals and blocks guy, really good efficiency from the field and from the line, but it's getting on the court that's going to be the problem. Now, speaking of getting on the court, that's a problem. Wes Johnson's a guy that's had fantasy value in the past for his ability to get steals, blocks, and threes. But why did he fall so far out of Doc Rivers' favour last season, especially when the Clippers were just calling out for someone to play some level of wing defense when it was Paul Pierce and Allen Anderson out there at times?
Yeah, so the Wesley Johnson story with the Clippers is a little bit of an interesting one. He came to the team 2 seasons ago. And in that first season, if you'll remember, the Clippers were in the Lance Stevenson experiment.
Yep.
And when that didn't quite work out as planned, the Clippers started looking at different options at small forward, and the number 2 option was Wesley Johnson. And Wesley Johnson started 1 game, and in that 1 game, I believe Gordon Hayward torched him for like 44 points. And the next game, Luc Mbamute was the starter at small forward. And Wesley Johnson was back in that backup role. And what we've found with Wesley over the last 2 years, what I've personally observed, is that it's not that he's a totally incapable player, but it's that he really doesn't do much at an NBA level at the small forward position. I think when you put him at the power forward position and you let him use his length and his awareness, and he's been in the league for a while, he can help you out as a team defender on a second unit, maybe in like a 12-minute role per game, but that's not especially bringing you enough value to even consider for fantasy purposes. But then last season, he just couldn't hit a shot. Below 25% from 3, how can you be a small ball combo forward if you can't make a shot? And then he can't dribble. He's probably dribbled 7 or 8 times in his 2 seasons with the Clippers. So what are you getting from a guy who can't play on-ball defense, can't dribble the basketball, can't make an open shot? All he is a lengthy team defender. That's not really rotation caliber. So I would be really surprised to see him get much of a chance for the Clippers this season. Although I do think if he does get a chance, hopefully we'll see him at 2016 levels where he was at least semi-productive in a combo forward role instead of 2017 levels where he really was not an NBA player.
He was at his best when he played for the Lakers, and he was playing at power forward, so you're right, that is his position, but he's just not going to get those minutes on this team, and I agree that I think he'll probably play even less this season than what he did last season. So it was a good little run, Wes, of providing those triple one numbers, steal, block, and the 3 per game for those couple of years for the Lakers, but I think it's done now. If you had to give your breakout candidate for this team, Lucas, and you can use whatever criteria you want for breakout, who is it?
So I think I would go back to Austin Rivers. I think when you look at his splits between playing on the bench and starting, and then you look at his progression year to year since he came to the Clippers, I think he really has a chance to take a big step forward this season and establish himself as a capable starting guard, especially on a team where it feels like the Clippers have a lot of really good backups. Patrick Beverley, I'm a big Patrick Beverley fan, but he's like a fringe starter level guy. Austin Rivers feels more like a 6th man to me. Teodosic is an unknown quantity coming from Europe. Lou Williams obviously is a 6th man. So Austin really has that opportunity to prove that he's not a bench player. He's a starting caliber player. We've seen him be impressive in a lot of different areas. We've seen him be wildly inconsistent. And so I think he's a guy that really has the tools to potentially put it together and have a great campaign. I think I should also talk a little bit about Blake Griffin in this category, just because even though everyone already knows that he's a superstar and thinks of him in high regard, and even any places where his rankings might be somewhat lowered, it's more due to his injury history than his effectiveness as a player. But if Blake Griffin can stay healthy this season and he comes back in a year without Chris Paul, which means the team will be less successful, but he will have more of a role to really show what he can do, he might be able to come out here in his age 28 season. If he can put 20-plus points, get those rebounding numbers back up, get to 6 or 7 assists like we talked about, he would really establish himself as one of the premier stars in the NBA leading a playoff team, which is something that we haven't seen him do. It seems like every year we were saying this is going to be the year that Blake isn't the number one guy and Chris steps back a little bit. And every year Chris stayed really as the alpha and Blake was the beta. This year he will have to be the alpha, and I think that presents him with an opportunity to break out in a sense.
Yeah, look, he does have a huge opportunity, obviously, here, Griffin, to really put together a huge year to lead this team back to the playoffs and put together some big numbers to, I guess, recoup some of the value that his reputation has lost. I'm interested to see how he goes. In terms of value fantasy, guys, I've already talked about Gallinari. I think you can get quite a bit of value on him drafting late, and I really like Teodosic as that last pick player who can come in and get you 6 assists and get you some steals. I think he's a really solid value guy. DeAndre Jordan, if it's a roto league, he's too highly valued. If it's a head-to-head league, I think he's undervalued. And I think Austin Rivers at one, you said you like him for a break, and that's possible. He could definitely come in and average 16 or 17 a game. I still think that his lack of contributions in other areas does limit him. And at pick 113, I am almost 100% certain there are going to be other guys in that area that I like. But when you're looking at those last picks, taking someone, if you truly believe that they are in for a huge step forward, and that happens for many players, they can increase not only increase their opportunity, but increase their, say, per 36 rates. That happens for numerous players. We've seen that happen to guys like Will Barton and Kent Bazemore in previous seasons. Even though they got more minutes, all their per 36 numbers increase significantly too. So Rivers could be one of those guys who steps up in that regard, and that's a totally fine pick for that sort of late in a draft area. Before you go, Lucas, the Clippers Vegas over-under is set at 43.5. What are you leaning?
I'm leaning over. I've got you'd probably have a really hard time making me pick at like 46.5 or 47.5, because I've got them right in that 46 to 48 range. I think if they mesh well and they get a little bit of health, I could easily see them up in the low 50s, and I think that that's the case with a lot of teams in the Western Conference in that tier when you talk about Denver, Minnesota, etc. I think if either they have some chemistry issues or if they have some injury issues, you could potentially see them go underneath 40. So there's high variance for this team, especially because they're a team that has so many new faces. But my hunch right now, I've been feeling for a while in the 46 to 48 range. Feels about right to me, maybe closer to 46, hedging the injury bets, which I'm probably a little too optimistic on. But so if we're looking at 46, then I feel pretty comfortable with an over 43.5.
Yeah, I think I'd go over on 43. I'm not sure I'd go 46, but I think 44, 45 sounds about right to me. I haven't gone through and done all my over-unders for all the teams, but I think the people who are writing this team off as a team that's going to be below 40, I think that's a gross misrepresentation of how their team is going to look. We'll see, of course, but I think that they can be better than some people are anticipating that they end up at. Lucas, why don't you give us a plug of what you've got happening over on Locked On Clippers and anything else you want to promote, your Twitter handle, all that sort of good stuff.
Yeah, so you can follow me on Twitter at Lucas J. Hann. You can check out my writing at clipsnation.com, which is SB Nation's Clippers site. And you can follow along on Twitter there at ClipsNationSBN. We basically live tweet through every game. So if you end up with a Clipper on your fantasy team, we'll keep you posted on how they're doing. You can check out the Locked On Clippers podcast, obviously all the same places where you find Josh's podcast. And we're getting started with player previews for the Locked On Clippers podcast. So that might be something that could be of interest to you. In the next couple of weeks, I'll be doing, individual episodes, either an episode dedicated to a player. For some of the more bench players, I might do 2 or 3 in an episode, really looking in depth on what their season is going to be like, kind of a more expanded version of what we did in this show with Josh and myself, going player by player and looking at what it's probably going to look like this year.
Yeah, so go and check out Lucas's writing, his Twitter handle, and of course the Locked On Clippers podcast, which is part of the Locked On Podcast Network, and you can find all the information on every team throughout the network. So go and check out anything specific you want to hear, and subscribe to our podcast and leave us 5-star reviews. You can subscribe on Apple Podcasts, on Google Play, TuneIn, Stitcher, and now Spotify as well. So go and check out those. Or subscribe to these podcasts. Make sure you're getting them. It helps the shows a lot, and a 5-star review is also very, very awesome. Lucas, thank you for coming on and wrapping up this season preview series of podcasts that I've been doing.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me, Josh.
All right, guys, we are done here. Thank you so much for listening, everyone. See ya. Austin Rivers.